We cover many cases on this channel. Murders with no compassion, horrifying kidnappings, and courageous survival stories. However, there's one type of case that always leaves me feeling particularly sad, and sometimes even overwhelmed, and those are the cases of unidentified bodies found murdered. People whose lifeless body is found only to remain nameless for years, decades, and sometimes even forever. The tragedy of the murder seems larger when you add in the loneliness of being known as just a pseudonym or a number. Thankfully, in the past few years, thanks to the advances of forensic science, many bodies are being matched to names, and although the circumstances of the victim's death can rarely be solved after so many years, at least there is now a name and a story attached. Today's case falls right into this category. For 44 years, the body found in a septic tank in Alberta, Canada, was known only as Septic Tank Sam. With no ID on him, no matching dental records, and no leads on any missing persons cases, police weren't able to figure out who this man was. All they knew was the 2 gunshot wounds and signs of being tortured before death suggested they were facing a homicide case. But without even knowing who the victim was, it was hard to even know where to start looking. But in January of 2021, a DNA match was finally found, and the information was released to the public only a few weeks ago. Septic Tank Sam's real name was Gordon Edwin Sanderson, and his story can finally be told. April 13th, 1977. The McLeods had made their way to their old farm near Tofield, Alberta. The land and the farmhouse were partially abandoned, since the family didn't visit very often. However, they still owned it, and had gone there that day to recover a septic pump they needed. They thought they could use the one from their old septic tank since nobody even visited the property. At least that's what they thought. When they opened the tank, they found a sock floating in the water. But looking a little closer, they found the sock wasn't just floating there on its own. It was attached to a human leg. It wasn't long before authorities made their way to the farm and began emptying the septic tank using buckets. And there, wrapped in a bed sheet, tied with a cord, was a person. The state of the body after being in the water for so long made it impossible to determine whether it was a male or a female, let alone recognize any other distinguishing features. It wouldn't be until after the autopsy when investigators gathered more details about this John Doe. The victim was a male, with a height of 5'5" to 5'7", and weighed approximately 150 pounds. They believed he was of Native American descent. He had dark brown hair and was right-handed. The victim had possibly suffered of a serious undisclosed illness as a child. He was wearing a blue Levi's work shirt, a grey undershirt, blue jeans, grey socks, and brown wallaby-style shoes. When dumped into the tank, someone had tried to accelerate the decomposition of the body using quicklime. However, when quicklime comes in contact with water, it has the opposite effect, so the body had actually decomposed at a slower pace. Despite this, fingerprints couldn't be lifted, so the victim's dental records were the only identifiable feature they could use. The cause of death seemed to be the gunshot wounds he had on his head and his chest. However, that wasn't the only thing he'd endured. There were various signs of trauma and torture across his body. His hands were tied. The skin showed signs of being severely burned, probably with a blowtorch, as well as with lit cigarettes. There were signs of sexual mutilation and cut marks around the lower half of his body. Investigators determined the man had been in the septic tank at least 4 months, but because of the preservative effect of the quicklime being used in water, he could have been there for a whole year. Faced with this scenario, investigators had 2 questions they needed to answer. Who was this man? And who did this to him? The McLeod's farm was not an easy place to just stumble upon. It was also well known within the community in the area that it was an abandoned site. This meant whoever decided to use it as a hiding place for the body would have at least had some knowledge of the area, or contact with the locals, if not a local themselves. They needed time for the body to decompose so as not to be discovered, so they deliberately chose the farm because of its abandoned state. However, when combing the area for evidence, nothing of interest or relevance was recovered. It also wasn't clear if the torture and murder had taken place in the house or the grounds, or if the body was just moved there to be dumped in the tank. Since so much time had passed, any evidence left behind would have easily been washed away by rain or removed by the wild animals. Investigators had nothing. Since no evidence was recovered from the crime scene, their biggest chance of a breakthrough in the case would come after identifying the victim. However, this proved to be a much harder task than they thought. Due to the decomposed state of the body, the man's face was a mystery. Sketches of his possible appearance were drafted using his bone structure and what was left of any distinguishing features, but nobody recognized him as a missing loved one. The victim clearly had dental work done, so his dental records were passed along to hundreds of dentists and even dental magazines published in Canada in hopes to find him. Again, nothing. Without any leads, investigators began referring to him as Septic Tank Sam. And even though several reconstructions of his face were made, and DNA samples were pulled over the years, the identity of Septic Tank Sam, as well as the circumstances of his brutal ending, would remain a mystery for over 4 decades. Like we've seen with many other cases, there have been many breakthroughs in unsolved cases these past few years thanks to the advances of forensic science. The ever-growing DNA databases have matched many John and Jane Does to names, faces, and stories, sometimes even closing cold cases and giving families peace. Once again, it was a DNA match discovered by a lab in Houston which helped identify Septic Tank Sam. After building a genetic profile for the unknown man, the lab ran the information through several genetic databases until a possible match was found. After reaching out to the possible family members and running further tests, a positive match was found with Septic Tank Sam's sister. His real name was Gordon Edwin Sanderson, or Gordie like those closest to him used to call him, and after 44 years, we finally learned more about the mysterious John Doe who appeared in a septic tank. Gordon Edwin Sanderson was born October 22nd of 1950 in Manitoba, Canada. He was indeed of Native American origin, but had sadly been part of the famous 60s scoop, a period of time in the 50s, 60s and 70s during which Canadian authorities removed hundreds of children from Native American families and placed them in the care of predominantly white families to educate them in Christian values. The system claimed to want to insert these children into what they called mainstream society, but instead of promoting equal opportunities and ensuring the welfare of the entire community, the policies focused on taking the children away and putting them up for adoption. As a result, hundreds of families were forced to be torn apart. Children were stripped of their roots and language and forbidden to practice any aspect of their Aboriginal culture. Although these policies were abolished in the 80s, the effects within Indigenous communities are still visible to this day, a consequence of the traumatic upbringing of the children who were taken away and the families who were apart for so long. Gordon was separated from his family at the age of 9. He was placed in a foster home away from his parents. It wasn't long until he was struggling with addiction and he had several run-ins with the police during his lifetime. In the 70s, Gordon moved to Edmonton. The last his family ever heard of him was when he told them he would be traveling to Calgary to visit his younger brother. However, he never made it there. When he failed to meet his brother, the family contacted the authorities to report him missing, but no leads on his whereabouts were found. When the body was discovered in the farm, the lack of evidence didn't suggest the two were connected, so Gordon's name was never even a part of the investigation. To this day, and even with the body identified, the case is far from being closed. Gordon's brutal murder and the disposal of the body are still a mystery. Investigators are revisiting the homicide investigation now that they know who Gordon is. This is why, for 6 months, his name remained a secret, so as not to interfere with the ongoing investigation. But sadly, there isn't much to be found. Over 40 years have passed, meaning many of the friends, family, or potential suspects of being Gordon's killer have either passed away, moved, or just don't remember what happened so long ago. So there is a possibility that we may never discover who did this to Gordon Sanderson. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, and please consider subscribing if you enjoy content like this. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you in the next video.